Hello viewers, this is me, Ewaenruwa Nomaren, and this is my channel, It Pays to Fear God. This is where we learn about God, His beloved Son Jesus Christ, and their kingdom purpose, the three most important subjects that we can ever learn about, talk about, or discuss in the entire Holy Bible, according to John chapter 17, verse 3. The subjects that I have prepared for you and myself today is captioned Dwelling in God's Estate. However, before I get into that, I once again have a tune that some of us might enjoy, and while the tune's playing, please try to subscribe and click the notification bell to be notified when we make future uploads. Once again, the subject that I have prepared for you and myself today is captioned Dwelling in God's Estate. God's estate is like a rich man's house. When a rich man invites you to come serve as a maid or a servant, or even asks you to be his wife, there is this kind of joy that you have. It's not even just about the opportunities that you're going to have, the money that you'll be able to inherit, but it's just that honor of being a servant or a maid or whoever of a rich man. Similarly, the ability to worship God is scarce. It is difficult. And not many people can take part and be involved in such a business. And that is why people in the Bible, like David the psalmist, like the apostles, they celebrated the fact that they were children of God. In 1 Peter chapter 2, in verses 9 and 10, St. Peter, reflecting on this, had stated, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should shew forth the praises of him that called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy." Same goes with what St. Paul had stated in Colossians chapter 1, from verses 12 to 14. During the intro of his letter to the Colossians, he stated, "Giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins." See also Titus chapter 3, from verses 3 to 6. And David the psalmist also stated in Psalm chapter 65, verse 4, "Blessed is the man whom thou choosest, and causest to approach unto thee, that he may dwell in thy courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of thy house, even of thy holy temple." See also Psalm chapter 91, verse 1. But why were such people as David the psalmist, St. Paul, St. Peter, and all the other righteous ones of God celebrating to be in God's estate? What is so special about God's estate? Well, that is what I'm going to be discussing today. When we talk about God's estate, we have to understand it doesn't have to do with us going to where God lives and living with him. It has to do with his principles. When we agree with God's principles, we are not only creating a bond with God, but we are living in his estate. And in Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15, Isaiah the prophet had stated, "For thus saith the high and lofty one, that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, and to revive the heart of the contrite ones." And also in Psalm chapter 15, in verses 1 and 2, David the psalmist had stated, "Who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly, and worketh righteousness, and speaketh truth in his heart." David the psalmist also stated in Psalm chapter 25, verse 9, "The meek will he guide in judgment, the meek will he teach his ways." St. Paul also talked about the temple of God in Ephesians chapter 2 from verses 19 to 22, describing the temple of God and its pillars as the apostles and generally the righteous ones of God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, in verses 16 and 17, St. Paul also stated, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him will God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are." See also Hebrews chapter 3, verse 6. And because God doesn't change from his principles, if we read Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, people who dwell in God's estate will have the same qualities as all other righteous ones of God. There are people who are humble, people who accept God's principles. And not just accept God's principles, but living in God's estate has its boundaries. And if we want to live in God's estate, we have to not only acknowledge those boundaries, but always have them in mind when we want to make various decisions in our lives. These aren't physical boundaries, but there are certain laws that God has set in office, and he doesn't want us to step farther past or beyond those laws. Otherwise, we are going to have left God's estate, and the whole goal is to remain within it. And I'm going to give several examples now of people who do not remain in God's estate, so that we not only understand what it means to leave, what reasons that people might have to leave God's estate, but it can also help us understand how to remain within it by simply not emulating or mimicking what such people were doing. For example, Adam and Eve is a typical story of people leaving God's estate. In Genesis chapter 2, in verses 16 and 17, God gave them one very clear, self-explanatory, and straightforward principle. You can eat whatever you want. Remember, there were billions of trees in the world. They would never end. But God still said, this tree right here is a tree that I want to keep for myself. I do not want you guys to eat it or touch it or generally have anything to do with it. But they left God's estate not only by listening to Satan and the devil, but by buying their ideas. They hadn't left God's estate when they were just listening to what Satan and the devil had to say, listening to his offer, but it was when they bought what Satan and the devil had sold to them by eating the apple that they left God's estate, because they left his boundaries. They did not regard his principles. And that was what led to the punishments in Genesis chapter 3 from verses 15 or from verses 16 to 19. Another story is Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. A very famous proverb in the time of the Chronicles and still used in this modern world. There we see Jeroboam, if you read the King James Version, was a man of valor, a man of standing if you read more modern versions today. And he had nothing to do with the king. He was just a servant of Solomon, the current king at the time, who also left God's estate, marrying an extraordinary amount of wives, 1,000 as the account in 1 Kings chapter 11 states. And not only was it just the amount, but it was also where he got them from. He was getting them from the Amorites, from the Moabites, from the Edomites, people that God battled, destroyed, and generally defeated long time ago. Now he was loving such women, making gods for them, and he just ended up becoming a sinner because he generally disobeyed God's law and he did evil in the sight of God, meaning he did not obey his commandments, statutes, or principles, whichever word you want to use. But Jeroboam was offered to be king over 10 tribes of Israel simply because of what Solomon did. And Jeroboam, once he ended up becoming king and he got settled, he saw that people were still going to Jerusalem, and that was ruled by Rehoboam because he got 10 tribes while one was still left for Rehoboam to just save the house of David like a lamp, as it was described in the King James Version. And then he said, well, the thing is, I don't want them to go to Jerusalem. I want them to come to me instead. And then he builds 2 calves in Dan and Bethel, just so that people would not have to go to Jerusalem, because that's like the headquarters of God's worship at the time, and that was where everybody was going. So he wanted to bring them to himself, and as a result, he built 2 calves, not being asked by God to do so. Remember the offer that was made to him in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 38. If you obey my voice, if you do what I want you to do, you will be established. Your kingdom will endure as long as I want it to. But because he disobeyed God, he left his boundaries. That was what led to the famous proverb, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. Because now Dan and Bethel became so much more convenient that now people were worshiping God, not only through the wrong medium, but because of that, they weren't even really worshiping God to begin with. And that caused Jeroboam under all the punishments that came as a result of what he did. It's very important that we keep this in mind. Another person who left God's estate was Satan the devil himself, because in Isaiah chapter 14 from verses 12 to 15 and from Ezekiel chapters 25 to 28, it illustrates not only the kind of power, status, and glory that he had in God's kingdom, or generally God's organization. His pride just went up with all of that glory. And as a result, he left God's estate by wanting to be God himself. Maybe not in power, but he wanted to rule people, which is why he is considered the God of this world. If we read 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verses 3 and 4, specifically verse 4. Same goes with the Israelites. They left God's estate because they had an agreement with God in Exodus chapter 19 from verses 4 to 5, where God specifically told the Israelites, "Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenants, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine." This wasn't a joke. He was going to ensure this if they were interested. However, if you read Ezekiel chapter 16 from verses 8 to 63, their result, what they were doing, was completely opposite of what God was providing for them. They left God's estate by taking or collecting everything that God gave to them and then using it to serve the Gentiles, condemned in the Ten Commandments. If you read Exodus chapter 20 and verses 3, 5, and 6, the Israelites left God's estate by not only disobeying God, but casting him aside, forsaking him. That Jeremiah chapter 2 from verses 2 right down to verse 19 gives us a lot of detail. God was even asking himself and asking the Israelites, "Have you found any iniquity in me? Am I wrong all of a sudden? Have I sinned in fact?" If you read that Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 5, the answers to all those questions were no, but of course it was because the Israelites loved the Gentiles and wanted to emulate them, and they therefore caused trouble for themselves because they did not dwell in God's estate. Therefore, if we want all the blessings of God, we have to dwell in God's estate and remain in it. And it's not that hard. All we need to do is to know the boundaries. That goes with studying the Bible, understanding its principles, the Word of God, and using that to understand where God sets his boundaries. Then we operate inside the boundaries because there's still lots of freedom, there's still lots of suggestions that can be made just within the boundaries. And that is when we can reign in peace within our families, within our marriages, within whichever place that we are. However, we have to understand in some more detail what it really means to keep within God's state. In Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1, St. Paul, talking about how we do everything that we can to remain in God's estate, had stated, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us." See also 1 Corinthians chapter 9 from verses 24 right down to verse 27. This has to do with understanding the sin that can doth so easily beset us. Remember, this sin can vary from person to person. It can be adultery, it can be lasciviousness, it can be covetousness, it can be anything mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 11. Romans chapter 1 from verses 28 to 32. Galatians chapter 5 from verses 19 to 21. And 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 9 and 10. The sin that can move us away from God's estate, exceed the boundaries. We have to not only battle such things, but still go ahead and reason from the Bible. If you read Isaiah chapter 1 verse 18. Jesus Christ was somebody who not only understood the Bible and the principles of God, but dwelled in God's estate because he lived his life according to the principles of God. In John chapter 5 verse 30, he stated, I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. This means that he's not looking for ways to leave God's estate. He's not trying to find ways to develop his own inventions. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 29, like humanity had done. No, he reasoned within the boundaries that God provided for him. And that is why the rewards mentioned in Philippians chapter 2 from verses 5 to 11 and Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 2 and 3 were ended up being rewarded to him because he reasoned within God's estate. And that was why in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 20 it stated, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. God called us to the faith, if you read John chapter 6 verse 44, and we have to abide by the rules. It's very important that we keep this in mind. I hope we now understand what it means to dwell in God's estate and the various steps that we have to take to not only understand God's boundaries, but try not to step out of them. In 2 Peter chapter 2, from verses 20 to 22, St. Peter telling us about what it means to leave God's estate had stated, for if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. For it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, after they have known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them. But it has happened unto them according to the true proverb, the dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the soul that was washed to her wallowing in the mire. He was quoting Proverbs chapter 26 verse 11, and also that chapter 21 verse 16, wandering out of the way of understanding to the congregation of the dead. We have to remain in this. We have to remain in God's estate, because God's estate is eventually going to become a peaceful habitation. If we read Isaiah chapter 33 verse 20, which states, look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken. However, if we want to dwell in such a tabernacle, we have to first of all be called by God, being the chosen generation. And many of us viewers might be in that condition. And after we have been called by God, that we have to study the Bible to understand where the boundaries are and try as much as possible not to cross them. And I choose to end my talk on the subject, dwelling in God's estate. To conclude this episode, I once again have a tune that some of us might enjoy. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something most importantly. Please sure to subscribe, share this video, and click the notification bell to be notified when we make future uploads. Thank you for listening.